Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so thrilled to have you here today as we look at the book Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, and the Struggle for Equality. And we'd like to give a special thanks to Citizen Travelers, a nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Companies, for their continued support of Book Breaks. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Leah, who will be answering your questions in the second half of the chat. Hey, Leah. And without further ado, we are so thrilled to welcome Dr. Brown-Nagin, who's the Dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and the P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School and Professor of History at Harvard University's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Her previous book, Courage to Dissent, Atlanta and the Long History of the Civil Rights Movement, won the 2012 Bancroft Prize in American History. Welcome, Dean Nagin. We are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Gina. I'm excited to be with this audience.
Yes, so just to start us off, can you give us an overview of this book and for folks who might not be familiar with Motley?
Mhm. Sure, I'm happy to provide an overview of the book. It is a life and times of Constance Baker Motley, who was born in a working class family in the 1920s, came of age during the Great Depression, and became the first Black woman who was appointed to the federal courts. And before that, she was a lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund who helped to litigate the cases that made it possible today for African Americans and whites and people of all races to be together in public schools and parks and playgrounds. She also was a groundbreaking politician, Manhattan Borough president, and really she was an extraordinary lawyer, also an extraordinary person. I'm sure I'll be able to talk about some of those details as we go along.
Absolutely. And in your introduction, you write a theme embedded in the world of James Baldwin. What is the price of the ticket? Can you tell us how it relates to the story, that quote?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, Constance Baker Motley achieved great things that she was not expected to achieve as a woman and as a person of color. Um, and typically, when one thinks of someone being appointed to, say, the federal courts, which is a pinnacle of the legal profession, one would think of that as an undiluted victory. And yet the Baldwin quote is meant to impart to readers the theme that for people who come from marginalized communities and who achieve such great things, there can be sacrifices made along the way. In fact, it is likely to be the case that there are sacrifices made along the way, both personal ones, but also professional ones. A lot of those downsides have to do with the way in which one has to um, perhaps not live what people these days call one's whole truth or bring one's whole self to the workplace. That is not the way it really works for people who, by virtue of the way in which they are embodied, excuse me, are going against the grain. So she, by virtue of just showing up in a courtroom or in a Senate chamber, and certainly on the bench, was being transgressive. And so there was a price to being Constance Baker Motley, just as I would say likely continues to be a price for women and people of color, people from working class backgrounds who end up being a part of the establishment.
Yes, and now starting at the beginning, you write that Motley's parents' heart was with the British Crown. Can you tell us what you meant by that and how that impacted her childhood?
Sure. Her parents were West Indians. They were born in Nevis. They came to this country, immigrated in the early 20th century. And they thought of themselves always as having a strong connection to England, to the culture of England. They thought of themselves as special people, as unlike African Americans. In particular, the Constance Baker Motley's father forbade her to interact with, play with the children of Black Americans who had migrated to New Haven seeking opportunity. And so it turns out that he had a lot of the same racial attitudes that Motley would end up fighting in the courtroom. And so I argue in my book that either because of or despite of the racial views of her father, she became the civil rights queen. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression, though, that her parents' cultural background, quite culturally conservative, socially conservative, was all negative. I would say that uh, having been taught that she was special, that somehow she was, culturally or socially superior, was important to Motley, gave her a kind of armor that she really needed, a sense of herself, a positive sense of herself that she needed very much when she became a lawyer, went to Southern courtrooms during the era of segregation, and often was treated with great disrespect by lawyers, judges, everyday people. I would say that she had a sense of she was able to let it all slide off her back because she had such a very strong self-concept from growing up in that immigrant home with socially conservative values, where she had been taught that she was special.
And she also grew up in the shadow of Yale University. Can you tell us how that shaped her?
Yeah, such an interesting topic. She, as I said, she grew up in a working class neighborhood. Some would call it, characterize it as a ghetto. And her family, all of the men worked at Yale in service positions. In a position where they would have been perceived as inferior by most of the folks at Yale. She was never, invited onto campus or taught that she might one day end up there. And yet she took a great deal of pride in her family's connections to Yale, as did all of the family members. And so she did not have a sense of being less than because her family members were working in those service positions. It actually gave her a sense of how invaluable education could be in a life, and also made her even more inclined than she already was to ascend to a better position in society.
Yeah, and speaking of, can you tell us about her academic career and her experience in law school?
Sure. Well, she attended the public schools in New Haven, Connecticut. These were integrated schools that she attended. She did really well in school. She was able to then matriculate to college as a result of the help of a philanthropist, Clarence Blakesley, who was a graduate of Yale, who was so very impressed with her. Initially, she went to Fisk University, which is an historically Black college in Nashville, Tennessee. She left after a year, and she was in college during the war years. There was a lot one could say about why she left, but ultimately she landed as an undergraduate at New York University. And the environment in the village was much more in keeping with what she was accustomed to as a Northeasterner. It was bohemian. It was very leftist. And she ended up doing really well at NYU, and then matriculated to Columbia Law School during the World War II era. which would have been a time when there's no civil rights law. There are very few Black students, there are very few women students, and yet she did fine there, although it was so socially isolating. And perhaps most importantly about her time there, she was invited to apply for an internship at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she met the great Thurgood Marshall, who was a part of a small band of lawyers who were seeking to upend Jim Crow. And she made a wonderful career by virtue of being a part of that milieu. The great thing about it is, she ended up in public interest law because she was interested in social change. But it's also true that she couldn't have gotten a job, and she didn't get a job at the lucrative New York City law firms because of race and gender. It's a common story. It's one that Ruth Bader Ginsburg could tell, Sandra Day O'Connor, and other women lawyers of the era. But ultimately, she had fond feelings for Columbia Law School because it helped to pave the way for this brilliant career in the legal profession.
Yeah, and Thurgood Marshall plays a big part in the story. Can you tell us about her relationship with him?
Sure. Thurgood Marshall does indeed play a big role in her life. He is a mentor. She always felt very appreciative to him because he hired her at a time when the white male law partners at the major New York City firms would not. And yet it was not all rosy with Thurgood Marshall, which is not unusual, even in a mentor-mentee relationship. Marshall was of his time, which meant a number of things. One of them was that he was a womanizer, and he sexually objectified Constance Baker Motley, which is not to say he sexually harassed her. There's no evidence of that, but she very much was a woman in the office. He admired her, but it was uncomfortable for her at some times to be the only woman for most of her career, 20-year career at the Legal Defense Fund, among men, including Marshall, who was very earthy. He unsurprisingly really was not particularly progressive as to gender, even around her salary, around promotion. One of the great sad elements of her career was when she was passed over for director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when Thurgood Marshall left, and yet she loved him, he loved her. And so it's a story about the kind of setback in a career that for a woman and a woman of color, although overall it was a great career, and he was a really important figure in her life.
Yeah, and another really fascinating chapter in the book is her work in the desegregation of University of Mississippi and her relationship with James Meredith. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it is a bittersweet story. Um, her time in Mississippi. She did indeed represent James Meredith, who wrote a letter to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund saying he wanted to desegregate Ole Miss. Ole Miss was a bastion of white supremacy. It was a very important institution for white people in Mississippi. They thought it was their birthright to attend. And so to attack the segregation at Ole Miss it was quite an astounding aspiration. Motley became Meredith's lawyer, and they both went through quite a lot trying over the course of many appearances in court and many efforts to defeat their spirits, I will say. They managed to prevail, but again, it's the theme of victory with significant costs. There came a time in the case, because James Meredith was subject to threats of retribution. He was at one point alleged to have fraudulently voted in the state of Mississippi, that he wanted to give up. And it was Motley who not only served as his courtroom lawyer, but his friend, his therapist. She told him that, after all of the months that they'd spent fighting against segregation in Mississippi, it was no time to give up. And they were dogged in their determination, as they had to be. Many rounds in court, during which Motley was sometimes mistreated. And to give an example, one of her opposing counsel, a white gentleman, segregationist from Mississippi, refused to shake her hand, and refused to call her Mrs. Motley, so with the honorific that would be expected. And to go back to what I said before about her armor, she was really just quite taken aback, although she knew intellectually that she was in a bastion of white supremacy. She was taken aback, and she would say, I'm a graduate of Columbia Law School, and I'm from the Motleys of New Haven, or Bakers rather, of New Haven, and how could he possibly not understand that I am his equal? And so there are many stories about that before Meredith ultimately prevailed, but not without violent resistance to him. And it was a great case that is one of the building blocks to higher education today, which is desegregated.
And speaking of sort of violent acts, you also, a really heartbreaking moment is her relationship with Medgar Evers. So if you could tell us how his assassination affected her.
Right. Medgar Evers was the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, and he was responsible for Motley's caretaking when she came down to Mississippi. He would pick her up from the airport, take her back to the airport. She stayed with him and his wife, Merle, when she was in Mississippi. And they were under threat of their lives together, often when they were traveling to and from the airport and around the state. I tell a story about how they were traveling along the state highway in Mississippi once, and Medgar said to Motley, "Don't look back. We're being tailed, and it's by the state police," which is not when you're in that circumstance to be understood as a public safety official, right? It's the police are a threat, and there are many of those instances. And the story ends very sadly because Medgar Evers was assassinated, and he was assassinated in a way that Motley actually warned him about. Brian Della Beckwith hid behind some shrubs in the front yard of the Evers home. And Motley had warned him that they should actually cut those bushes because someone could attack him in that way. He was assassinated at a time when she was not in Mississippi, but it was deeply distressing for her, because Evers was her friend, but also it brought to the forefront of her mind how much she had been in danger when she was in Mississippi. And she was a wife, she was a mother, and it was as if the entire episode illustrated how courageous one had to be as a civil rights lawyer during that time in Mississippi, because it all could have ended very badly at any moment.
Now, you mentioned her being passed over for this job in 1961. How did that sort of lead her to enter into the political realm?
Mhm. So it's a great lesson. She was passed over. She was very disappointed, but it opened her up to other possibilities, other ways of thinking about her career. So she had been at the Inc. Fund for 20 years, and she was invited after being passed over to run for the New York legislature by politicos in the state and the city who understood that she was very accomplished. Um, uh, she was a hero to many in the state and in the city, and she had name recognition. As her name had been all over the pages of the New York Times, all newspapers, and she decided to give it a try. It was risky for her to stand for office, but she ended up doing so. She was a pathbreaker in the New York State Senate, and then became Manhattan Borough President. Um, and I think that it's really telling about the depth of her talent that she was able to be successful in politics. It's a very different world from being a courtroom litigator, and yet she was great in it. And she also took from her time in politics. She was only in politics for a couple of years, then was nominated to the bench by President Johnson. She took from that experience a real sensitivity to the different roles represented by the different branches of government, which meant that she was actually quite careful as a district judge to make sure that she was playing her proper role.
Yes. And how did that appointment to the bench occur?
Well, it wasn't easy, I can tell you that. Um, there was opposition to Motley's appointment, both to the initial seats that Johnson wanted to appoint her to, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and to the district court as well. These are coveted appointments. There were plenty of people with the sense of just a presumption that a white man would be appointed, as had always been the case. She was the first woman, as well as the first Black woman, appointed to the U.S. District Court in Manhattan. Very prestigious. There were those who argued that she couldn't handle the financial cases on that the Southern District judges were accustomed to, that she didn't have experience as a lawyer in the state of New York. Of course, she had vastly more experience than nominees typically all over the country. And it was hard fought, including by senators. James Eastland of Mississippi tried to kill the nomination, arguing that she was a communist. Now, Eastland was he was an alum of Ole Miss. He had been very upset when Meredith desegregated Ole Miss, represented by Motley. So he was an enemy of hers, but was not able to prevent her from taking her seat. Many people stood up for her. Johnson loved her, and fortunately, she was appointed to the U.S. District Court.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit more about her relationship with Johnson?
Yeah, so Johnson, was a complicated figure. He was both racially progressive for the era and also racially traditional. He was sincere, but also a real political animal, as people who know about Johnson would know. he really wanted to appoint women and African Americans to positions in the government, and yet he was willing to compromise when there was backlash from various quarters against Motley. And yet he had great personal affection for Motley. And the same way as Thurgood Marshall, they're men of their time, but they recognized her talent, respected her. There's this great picture in the book of Johnson and Motley sitting across from each other at the White House. And you could see just her eyes are dancing, and his are too. You could see the affection for one another, and it is a great thing that Johnson had the political will to appoint her. It's not something he had to do. It was advantageous to him because he wanted to have the civil rights movement behind him. But he held his ground in the face of those who were opposed to her.
And now, can you also tell us about her relationship with Martin Luther King Jr.? Because that's also fascinating as well.
Right. So Martin Luther King Jr. was her client. She represented him in a number of contexts when he was in jail in Georgia, when he was helming the Birmingham Civil Rights Campaign in 1963. And King also was a man of his time, known for his affairs, also castigated by women in the civil rights movement, such as Ella Baker, for being sexist and not recognizing women who played leadership roles, women like herself in the civil rights movement. And yet, when it came to Constance Baker Motley, he respected her. He was very careful to make it clear to everyone that he was not involved in an affair with her. So, for instance, when she visited him in his hotel room at the Gadsden Motel in Birmingham, which was sort of a headquarters for the civil rights movement, he would leave the door open, lest anyone get the wrong idea. And he listened to her. He put her in the same category as Thurgood Marshall and other great lawyers for the movement. And she was in a position of guiding him, telling him what he should do, and he listened to her. And so it's really a story about how she was unique and she was able to navigate places and roles that just were where she wasn't perceived as belonging. And yet she managed to bring people along, and it had to do, her ability to do that had to do with both her accomplishments, but also her personality and the way she carried herself. She was she was attractive. She was feminine. She dressed really well. And so there are a lot of lessons, I think, in about who is able to ascend under very difficult circumstances in all of those relationships that Motley had with these strong men.
Yeah, and our chat is starting to blow up with questions, which we love. So before I pass you over to Leah, can you just tell me what you hope readers take away upon finishing this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I want them to take away is how Motley was able to pursue her commitment to opportunity, to equality over the course of her life, despite, as I said, being presumptively an outsider in all of these roles, and she was able to flex. So she went from, being turned away from the law firm to working in public interest law, to having a setback, not getting a promotion, to being a politician, to being on the federal court, and just being flexible, being dynamic, and in all of those different roles, maintaining her commitment. And I think it's a lesson for those today who are similarly committed to a struggle for equality and find that it's not easy terrain. Well, it's never been easy terrain. And Constance Baker Motley illustrates how one nevertheless can be a change agent. That's one of many lessons I want people to take away.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great spot to pass you over to Leah, who's going to ask some audience questions and share our student scholar question of the week. Take it
Okay.
away, Leah. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gina, and thank you, Dr. Brown-Nagin, for this first part of the discussion. It was really interesting. And so before I take any audience questions, I would like to focus our attention to the History Scholar of the Week. And so the History Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests a question, and they can win themselves and their teacher a $50 gift card for the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. And so this week, our History Scholar winner is Chloe. And Chloe's question is, what was Constance Brown's reasons for shifting from law to politics? And what was her political career or political persona like? And was it different from her legal career?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned, the shift from being a courtroom lawyer to being a politician was opportunistic. She answered the call, which she had received many, many times before, to enter politics because she was open to new opportunities after being denied a promotion. When she was in the New York State Senate and then in the Manhattan borough presidency, she was herself. She was always pretty reserved person. She commanded respect from the way that she moved through the world. Super smart and competent, deeply interested in inequality and doing what she could in those roles to ensure that her constituents, and I'm thinking of the Manhattan Borough Presidency here, her constituents were able to secure budget lines from the city to ameliorate inequality. She was very interested in the plight of impoverished families, in women and children, and in unjustified police searches. She filed bills about that when she was in the Senate, and so she was essentially the same person, just using different tools in order to seek equality. And I will mention that one of her friends during her time in the legislature was Shirley Chisholm, and they were of a type, although Motley presented very differently, not as bombastic or assertive. They were on the same team and really supported each other in the political realm.
Yeah, amazing. I think we had a couple of questions about Shirley Chisholm too. But one of our first questions was from Gretchen, and she was asking about Polly Murray and whether Motley and Murray knew each other and whether they had similar experiences regarding like crediting in their work for segregation, because she says that Murray often was not credited as much as she could have been for the work that she did in the legal defense.
Right. Polly Murray and Constance Baker Motley did know each other. They were friends. They were operating in the same circles of progressive lawyers. They supported each other's careers. In fact, a quote from a note that Polly Murray sent to Motley when she was confirmed to the federal bench, and the note said, "Hooray for our side." So they thought of each other as allies, and it was a beautiful thing to find from my work in the archives that was true. As to whether they had similar experiences in being denied credit for work that they did in the civil rights movement, I would say probably yes. And yet the beauty of their lives is that they both kept going. And there were plenty of people who knew how good they were. Murray and Motley had different experiences of gender, I will say. I think people know that Murray was what we would call non-binary today. And I do think that the difference in their gendered experiences probably meant that Motley was, she was more a part of the establishment among those lawyers, and of course became a part of the establishment of the country's government structure. Yet I actually gave a talk where I compared the two of them. They had a lot in common. There's a way in which, as I've done in my answer, one can really start to tease out how gender shapes a life and shapes careers from comparing those two figures.
That was a great answer. And the next question is a bit more general, and it's from April, and she asks whether you can speak to Motley's relationship with African American women in general and like their influence, I guess, as a whole or maybe individual on her life.
Well, she was a part of that community. She had many friends who were African American women. She also had friends who like Bella Abzug. She knew Betty Friedan. So friends across all backgrounds, races. She often, when she was in politics in particular, gave talks to civic groups, some of which were groups of African American women, and she acknowledged her sense of kinship with those women when she gave those talks. And of course, when she went across the country litigating cases, she was for many women, including African American women, just a star. They loved her. They thought of her as a role model. They were proud of her, and thus she had the experience of, going to courtrooms, outside of courtrooms, and really being met with adulation by Black women and men and white women too, in some circumstances. So yes, there definitely was a relationship there. And I would characterize it as her being a symbol and being a representative of her race and gender.
Nice. Okay, thank you. Another question was, what inspired you personally to explore the achievements of Constance Baker Motley, and how do you see her influence still shaping the fight today for equality and justice?
I decided to write the book about Motley as a result of writing about her for in my book, Courage Dissent, about Atlantan school and the civil rights movement. She litigated the Atlanta school desegregation case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the process of writing about that case, I realized that there was relatively little scholarship on Motley at the time, and I thought it was odd that would be the case. And I set out to give her the biography that I thought her achievements meant that she deserved. I also thought that she's an inspirational figure. She's a figure who allows us to think about race, gender, and class together, and how they influence life and opportunity. And so it was both a scholarly impetus, but also an opportunity to write about a figure whom I thought would be relatable to a wide swath of the public. And in terms of her link to struggles now, I think she's an inspiration to a lot of people. My former colleague, Lonnie Guinier, talked about Motley and how she inspired her. Kamala Harris has cited Motley. Ruth Bader Ginsburg lauded Motley as a role model. And perhaps most important, Justice Jackson, when she was appointed to the Supreme Court, cited Motley as an inspiring figure who had helped her remain determined to pursue her career in the law and her career as a judge over time.
Okay, great. And next question is from Diane. Did she have any interactions with Malcolm X? And if so, can you tell us about how that relationship existed?
Sure. I wouldn't say they had a relationship, but they did have interactions. I write about one such interaction in my book. It was during the mid-1960s when she was a politician in New York and was represented and was a symbol of liberal orthodoxy in the civil rights movement. And Malcolm X was a symbol of Black power, Black nationalism. They squared off at in an interview, a televised debate about what the direction of the Black freedom movement should be. And they took the positions that you would expect. And I will say that Malcolm X was pretty disdainful of the Black liberal position, the civil rights orthodoxy. And so I wouldn't say that it was a great interaction, a positive interaction between the two of them. And yet it's what one would expect given their respective views about how to achieve social change.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Another question that I think both Marta and Ed allude to is I'm asking you how you feel about the newest Black Heritage stamp that was issued in the honor of Motley. And do you think that this helps bring up her acknowledgement? And just, generally, they wanted your thoughts on the steps.
Right. So I was involved in the group that helped to make that happen. I mentioned in my book that there was no heritage stamp for Motley. And I was interviewed in the process of the nomination process, was interviewed when the stamp was released, and very happy that it has come into being. And of course, it does help to achieve one of the goals of my book, which is to ensure that Motley is remembered, that her legacy carries forward, and that she is held in the esteem that she ought to be held in given her achievements. I think you're muted.
Sorry, yes. Thank you. Another question that we had was from Linda. And so she has a little bit of context. She says, soon my 7th graders will be choosing an amendment to the US Constitution. And the assignment requires an explanation of history of the amendment along with a seminal court case interpreting the amendment. Would you be able to recommend any case that is understandable for a middle schooler in which Motley played a role?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first one that comes to mind, and perhaps the best one, is Brown versus Board of Education. Motley wrote the original complaint in Brown, which of course interprets the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It's perfect for students that age because it's all about the public schools, what they're for, building citizenship, and why, as a result, mandated racial segregation in the schools is fundamentally in tension with the ideals behind the country and the text of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. It would be a great one, I think, for students to learn about and to think about how it relates to their lives today.
Yeah, thank you. I think that'll be very useful for many of the teachers who are listening to our talk today. Another question that we have, and I think a few questions, was what surprised you about your research, or is there anything new that you got while doing this research? Because somebody mentioned that, yeah, this was a big book that took several years of research. So how did it change your perception on the civil rights movement?
Well, I've been studying civil rights movement for quite a long time. So I'm not sure that it changed my perception. I think that there are a couple of things that I would say were a bit surprising. First, there was a connection between Motley's family, which, as I've mentioned, was quite socially conservative, and the Black Panther movement. She had a family member who was a Black Panther and who actually ended up being killed in a conflict that had much to do with COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's vendetta against Black Panthers. It was very surprising given what I understood about her family and their strong belief in the politics of respectability. That is, it wouldn't be a family that would approve of anyone being involved in what would have been considered far left politics. And yet there was that connection. It's a very sad experience, obviously, for the family, and I was surprised to find it. The other thing that I would cite is how impactful her relationship was with her husband, and how progressive their marriage was given the time. She was by far the more prominent of the pair, and he did not have a problem with it at all. He was very much her champion, and it was just terrific to read about a marriage of that time where that was the case. It was based on a real affection for one another, and she, the woman, was at the forefront of the relationship professionally. He helped to take care of the kids, and it is an aspiration to which many professional women still find themselves talking about even today.
Yeah, thank you. We actually had one question about how Motley's role and her prominent position impacted her family life. So if you feel like you've answered that, yes, but if you have anything to add to that, that would be great.
Well, I'll mention she had a son, one child who was born right as she was litigating Brown versus Board of Education, which meant that she had to be out of the office for time right in the middle of all of that really hard work, day and night, long shifts. It was difficult for her to navigate that, and then difficult for her when she was litigating any number of cases down south to implement Brown. It meant that she had to leave her son behind or choose to bring him on the road when she was working. It was very hard for her. She used to find herself calling back to New York City when she was in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi to check on her son and husband, and then going back into the courtroom. She also would spend less time on the road than she otherwise might have because she wanted to limit the time away from home. And so the effort to balance her home life and her professional life was very much a theme of the book. And again, it's relatable, I would say, for many professionals today, women, but also men.
Yeah, thank you for answering that as well. Another question was about your previous work, Courage to Dissent, which also focuses on civil rights movement. And so I think you've kind of touched on that, but the question was, in what ways does Motley's story intersect with or diverge from the broader narrative of the movement that you write about?
Mm-hmm. Right. So she was at the center of the legal struggle for civil rights. One way in which I can say that her story diverges a bit is to talk about her relationship with Martin Luther King, how she was supportive of the direct action wing of the civil rights movement, the students, and King. And this is a distinction from, contrast with Thurgood Marshall, who was quite annoyed by the student activists because he said they were going to get someone killed. They were breaking rules. They, in contrast with the lawyers, they wanted they wanted change very quickly. Whereas the calling card of the lawyers was incrementalism. Motley understood Marshall's position, but she was much more open to representing the direct action wing, and as I've discussed, had quite a close relationship with Martin Luther King Jr.
Great. And then another question was about, I guess, your research process and your source base. I think you've mentioned several times that you've been doing this research for a long time, but if maybe students or teachers were interested, where might they find good resources on this topic?
Well, the book is very well documented with the collections of legal cases that Motley worked on from the National Archives, with legal documents and correspondence from the collections of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as well as the NAACP, the nonprofit organization. I found personal correspondence, for instance, between Motley and Pauli Murray, Motley and other significant figures in the civil rights movement, in collections at NYU and Smith College. I searched many newspapers for their depictions of Motley's work, and also for their descriptions of her. As one might imagine, there's a lot of attention to her appearance, and this theme of her being out of place comes up in the news reports. And I also conducted oral history interviews, which is always a great way of rounding out and checking what one thinks occurred through looking at the primary source documents and reading the secondary documents against what figures who were there at the time observed.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. And I think another question, oh yes, was about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and whether she also worked with Motley, what their relationship was like, and if there was a specific case. I think that was the question.
Well, so Ruth Bader Ginsburg came long after Constance Baker Motley, although they knew of each other. Motley would have been a senior role model figure for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the other comment to make there is that in the process of litigating on behalf of the women's struggle for equality, Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been citing some of the cases that Motley had worked on as courtroom lawyer. And then another thing I'll say is that when she was on the bench, Motley was quite supportive of the women's rights movement. And so although they were not in the same courtrooms together, they certainly were on the same side. They were allies.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then I think this last question is more about her legal approach, which might be a little bit technical, but could be still interesting. I'm sorry about that. It's asking if you could elaborate about Motley's like legal strategies and the tactics that she uses specifically in her legal work, and whether what she brought new in that field.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can characterize what made Motley such a great lawyer. I should mention that, of course, she's a part of a team of lawyers who had a set strategy for in these cases that were litigated generally under the 14th Amendment, attacking segregation. And they developed the strategy together. As a courtroom lawyer, she was known for being a very, very good questioner and cross-examiner, which is a critically important skill for making a case in the courtroom. She was a patient questioner, as one has to be, in order to lay the foundation for the point that one is trying to make in a line of questions. She also was, she was known for being, and this is in contrast to someone like Marshall, she wasn't folksy. She was, she had a way of just being acutely focused on the issue at hand. In fact, Charlene Hunter Galt, who was her client in the University of Georgia desegregation case, noted in her memoir that Motley could seem unapproachable even to her client because she was so laser focused on the issue at hand. She approached her cases with a sense of mission, and again was just a great courtroom lawyer. And they're lawyers who are best as appellate litigators. Then there are lawyers who are great trial lawyers, and I would put Motley in the category of a great trial lawyer, which meant that she made a great district court judge. These are the judges who preside over trials. So she was a quite stringent as a judge when lawyers appeared before her. She knew what good lawyering looked like at the trial level. And so that meant that she was quite the taskmaster in court.
Thank you so much. That was the last audience question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. And if you didn't get a chance to get your question answered today, a great way to remedy that is to purchase a copy of Civil Rights Screen. And if you do it right now through bookshop.org, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And next week, we'll hope you will join us as we welcome Matthew Davenport and his book, The Longest Minute, The Great San Francisco Earthquake and Fire of 1906. And we hope you'll visit gilderlerman.org for previous book break sessions, along with documents, essays, digital digital exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an honor to have you.
Thank you for having me, Gina. This was really fun.
Have a great day, everyone.